Thank you. Oh, I have trouble standing still. Thank you for asking me here. It's been an interesting day, and my mind is full of all of this stuff. I want to respond to what I've been listening to as opposed to what I'm supposed to talk about here. But I'm going to talk about what I'm going to talk about here. These come up in, okay, I'm figuring out the system here. I was fortunate enough a few years ago to participate in this report that was issued to the governor and to the legislature a few years ago, and it had a lot of people investigating formally for the state of Iowa what's going on with regard to climate change. And when they looked in that report at the climate, they looked at agriculture, Rick Cruz was part of it, they looked at flora and fauna, they looked at public health, and they looked at the economy, and that's where I came in. I got to do a little bit of a analysis on the economy. Now, the nature of working a collaborative project like that, there are two great things about it. First of all, you learn so much by listening to them, and it informs what you're doing. And second of all, because there's so many people on a project, they only gave me 4,000 words. You know, and thanks, guys. I mean, I can't even write a 4,000-word paragraph. I've had opportunities over the years to work on different types of projects associated with extreme weather. Prior to looking at that climate change study, we were gearing up already to look at the economic impacts of the 2008 floods, and ultimately we actually did an economic impact evaluation. So, I'm trying to get a handle on what happens when Mother Earth messes with us, and what happens to us on the economic side. As we moved on, we had the anticipated impacts of the 2012 drought. Again, we were trying to help people understand what might be going on, what are some critical areas, what are areas of vulnerability, what might we want to pay attention to, either on the economic side or on the policy side for trying to deal with this thing. This one's got a strange thing in it, but there's a capital I followed by an N below. Last spring, we were commissioned at Iowa State University, Lisa Athington and myself, to take a good look at our water vulnerabilities and the industries in Iowa that had some sort of critical demand for water. And if we ended up with a continuation of the drought, what might we be looking towards in terms of disruptions in our economy? Now, that ended up being really funny because we get it done in March and April, and then we don't get drought, we get rain. And people are laughing at us, and then all of a sudden in June and July, people are wanting to look at my report again. You know, it's kind of up and down here. And then I also had an opportunity to do a thing on the tourism-related economic impacts of the 2011 flood down the Missouri River. And what might that have done to that regional economy as a consequence of transportation disruptions and amenities disruptions and all of the disruptions to include household disruptions. So those are things. And then I was thinking today, as people were talking about cover crops just a little while ago, I did for some folks over at some feds, to what might be the economic impact of 1 million acres worth of cover cropping in Iowa, trying to set up a multiplier for that. So if you can see here, I'm kind of a social sciences field hand. I study a lot of different things, and lately, apparently, I'm in demand for catastrophes. This is from that 2010 report. And this was my opening sentence. If Iowa's climate is changing, that means Iowa's economy is changing, period. We're already adapting. We already know that. It is already infused as part of our economy, as part of our daily behavior. One way or the other, we're already adapting. And it's a complex system. But no matter what, there are going to be unarguable aspects, unarguable consequences for all aspects of Iowa's economy. And so we need to think about extreme weather events. Now, I'm thinking in terms of climate change in a general way early on in this, but some of the subsequent studies that I've done have had to do with extreme weather. When we did that study, it actually was released in January 2011. We had all of these categories that we looked at, but I also looked at, from the economics point of view, agricultural productivity and food costs. That was one of the categories. And we've maybe heard some of these stories. If we're a little bit warmer and a little bit wetter, the crops are a little bit happier, and we're going to have more grain, we're going to have more profits, we're going to have more supply. All in all, that sounds kind of good for farmers, all in all. Well, that's Iowa farmers. If it's drier and hotter in the southwest, where in the west, where we get most of our lots of the foods that we eat, that's not so good. But in Iowa, it was a positive. But there were lots of contrasts. And if it gets warmer and if it gets wetter, the diseases and the pests might become more virulent. It might impose costs on all of us. It might change the way we deal with things. I've heard stories that poison ivy is becoming very, very potent now. They just love CO2, I've been told. And then again, we have all these uncertainties. What happens if we become unexpectedly drier, warmer? What then? So we have a lot of uncertainties. That study also took a special look at the insurance industry, and you just had the opportunity to listen to the insurance commissioner. But Iowa's insurance industry is one of the biggest industries in Iowa. And I want to start right now. Every one of you who cares about an industry, you need to know that your industry is the most important in Iowa. Okay, just so you know. But I was agriculture, manufacturing, tourism. You're all great. You're all great, and you're all great big. The insurance industry is very, very important from 2 points of view. Of course, their exposure to dealing with the consequences of extreme weather, their exposure in terms of the types of firms and the types of industries and the types of activities that they're willing to underwrite. So we have that. We also have, this is a period in which, and I think he alluded to this when he talked, this is also a period of an opportunity to be creative with insurance, to create and price products that might better help people manage risk as we move on, as we move forward, as they say, big data, as more things become knowable, perhaps there are better roles, more important roles for the insurance company to play in this area. And I think it was AJ or somebody asked the question, what can the market do? I'm convinced, based on the research that I did preparing for this report, that the insurance industry itself has an important role to play in dealing with many of the consequences of climate change and extreme weather with regard to the management and the maintenance of households as well as business and business activity. We've seen what they've done in automobile safety and in design standards and across the board. I believe you're going to see that industry playing a larger and larger role as we go on. We also have climate change's impacts on households. Guess what? Warmer's a little bit better. We're more productive. Maybe we enjoy the outdoors more. Maybe all of those things are more or less good. But again, we also end up with maybe heat-related consequences over time. Who knows what it might lead to, because there's a lot of uncertainty as to where we might be 20, 30, 50, 60 years down the road. So I wanted to get through this part. I wanted to talk just a little bit about this to make sure that we set the stage that with regard to climate change, we have lots of areas of the economy that can be affected. The ag sector, the insurance sector, broad-based commerce, households, and how you and I get along, how you and I recreate, how you and I spend our leisure time. All of those things have a value to us as consumers, and they also have a value to us in our economy. So we need to think about what might be some of the consequences of extreme weather events. Of course, we already know about these things. We have private and public property damage. Business as usual gets interrupted. The way we expect things to carry out. People talk about disruptions in plantings. And that's not the only disruption that occurs. There's disruptions in every industry that's linked to agriculture. There's disruptions upstream and downstream. If you just think in terms of how industries are linked with one another. And those types of disruptions have consequences. They have a multiplier effect. They ripple through the economy. It does impose new costs for us. We talk about the woman with the household, the flood insurance costs. But nonetheless, over time, as risks become quantified, costs are going to become more sure. Historical settlement, we've already talked about that. Land use. Mr. Stowe talked about, we've always settled in these areas. Well, we've always settled in these areas, and they're darned expensive to maintain. And how are we going to cope with that? And how are we going to deal with that? And how expensive is it going to be? And overall, no matter what, coping with these types of events affects our overall quality of life. And our overall quality of life is the sum of all of the opportunities that we have as individuals and all of the opportunities we have collectively. Okay, so we move on. We've had some pretty big disturbances. I've had opportunities at Iowa State to look at a lot of things. In '93, not so much, but in 2008, 2010, 2011, and the drought, we've had lots of impacts that have been substantial. Now, you'll notice that we have a lot of impacts up there, and I'm putting up a lot of big cities. Well, that's where the concentration of capital is. That's where a flood does the most damage. Can a flood, like a tree falling in a forest, can a flood in an unpopulated area have an economic impact? Well, yeah, it can. But when it impacts with a dense urban area, it creates incredibly expensive consequences. And they've washed out bridges and roadways and multimodal transportation systems, and they've affected our ability to get from here to there or to do the things that we want to do. And they've had significant disruptions on commerce. So I had the opportunity to look at the 2008 flood. Now, there's a story about this. In June, we had this flood in June. I was on the telephone with the day of the flood in Cedar Rapids. I was on a conference call with officials from Cedar Rapids talking about a housing issue. It was a housing issue. Nobody knew that morning. And the next morning, you have a flood. That's the kind of thing that we're dealing with. And then we get Iowa City, and we get that big, icky, oozy mess of what becomes the Cedar River and the Iowa River and all the damage that it does. And about 3 or 4 days later, I get a call from a reporter in the New York Times, and she said, I understand you do economic impact. Yeah, I do that. So what's the economic impact of the flood? I said, I don't know. Everything's still underwater, lady. She said, I don't understand. I can get economic impacts from everybody else. Why won't you give me one? I said, I'm sorry, I just don't know. But early on, a lot of stakeholders tried to come up with some early numbers. And the American Farm Bureau, for example, looking at the inability to plant, the inundation, and the flooding, there's the announcement of $4 billion worth of some kind of economic impact. And that time they said it was in crop damages. Another $4 billion in commercial damages were estimated by state government officials in Iowa. They meant well. They were trying to add a lot of stuff up, and they put it in the basket, and they shook it, and they came up with $4 billion. And then there was another $2 billion that was added to that had something to do with household losses and the consequences, for individuals. And we had a number out there. It was $10 billion. $10 billion flood, $10 billion economic impact, $10 billion something. By September, they talked about the Rebuild Iowa was established. They had a committee. They had a group got together. They had experts go out and assess the damage. They had information from Small Business Administration. They had information from FEMA. They had information from the Department of Economic Development and Rio at that time. And by the time they were all done, they were able to come up with an estimate of what they thought the losses were. They weren't $10 billion. They were about $3.5 billion. So not as high. Now, I could have told the New York Times that, I could have just said 10 billion. I could have. But I thought it would be too high. So it was 3.5, and you can see the distribution of that. A big fraction of it was for housing and businesses. That's what gets impacted in an urban area. We also, though, had a tremendous amount of damage to our infrastructure systems, roads, highways, bridges, fresh and wastewater treatment systems, those types of things. Educational facilities, the universities got hit. Down at the bottom, their estimate at that time was about $930 million for the ag sector in terms of losses. Losses, costs, damages, all of this stuff gets mushed together. When we think about it in a taxonomy, we think of damages as the itemization of what happened. And then we try to figure out what was the value of what happened, and those are the losses. And then we move over to this territory called costs, and the costs are what the public pays to try to right what was done. And the difference between costs and losses are losses. And that's what happens in a disaster. We have losses. And so where we were at this time, though, these were the types of losses that they thought would be eligible for compensation. So the numbers that we're dealing with here are significantly less than the early on. The Farm Bureaus, the stakeholders, their numbers were way off. The state of Iowa's numbers were way off. City governments, they needed assistance, they needed help. They put a lot of these numbers together. They put a lot of first-hand testimonials from a lot of businesses together, and they said, you know, we're going to multiply this through and we're going to have a localized job economic impact. And then, of course, there was the politics of, you know, look, we're trying to get federal assistance. Some cities are trying to get state assistance. It was really hard to get a handle on what was the nature of all of the losses. Now, are these question marks? Oh, goodness gracious. They're supposed to be dots, but unless you have GIS fonts on your computer, they come up as question marks. What we were able to do when we did our research was what we looked at, what was the geography of loss. And they talked about rebuilding Iowa, but if you look at that table, the very high, the 6 or so very high impact counties accounted for 77% of the household losses, 74% of the public sector, the public's losses, and nearly 93% of the commercial losses. So we really had a great big impact in a very, very small area. You can see where the undeclared losses were in Iowa. And again, they were highly concentrated along that upper Iowa, Cedar Rapids River. You can see the job impacts from this. And a lot of people said, well, this is statewide, and you can see we had this dip, and then, boy, look what happened after that. Look what those floods did. Well, folks, we went into recession. This wasn't the floods. But a lot of people didn't know at the time that we were really sliding into such a recession, and they were attributing this to the flood. Here's the I-impact counties. This is the year-over-year employment, and they're actually above zero. They're still expanding, even though they've had the flood. And so, again, we're sorting out the economic impacts. These areas weren't contracting the way it was anticipated. And the ag impacts, the ag sector got significantly reimbursed to the tune of $1.1 billion or more. And average farm per farm earnings comparing 2007 with 2008, they did okay. And I'm just going to put this up all the way through here. And so by the time we had written our report, nearly $2.5 billion had been allocated. What had been the allocations for that? 85% of it went to assist in restoring households and buildings and infrastructure, the stuff that was quantified in the losses. And then the remainder of that was distributed a variety of different areas to include administration of the programs by the governments. So I'm going to move down here because I've only got so much time here. One of the things that we know is that public costs with regard to extreme weather mitigation are going to incrementally increase over time. Infrastructure is going to have to be hardened. We're going to spend more on it. And given that in a political process, if you spend more on one thing, you got to spend less on something else. And so we're going to have to make some very significant policy decisions. And if increased volatility in climate is going to lead to more disasters over time, we're going to have to learn to live with dire consequences for households, businesses, industries, and whatnot. The big question I have is whether those costs will increase the things that we do to deal with these before or after. History suggests we're going to deal with them after. What are the challenges? We've had a sharp erosion in local state government capacity, not just associated with the recession, but over time. We have seen an erosion in our willingness to fully fund and or fund a range of public goods and services. That's something we're going to have to deal with. We've had shifting federal emphases, and again, we have federal dysfunction, but we have shifting federal emphases and what constitutes federal responsibility. I'm going to argue that we need more and much more aggressive research on some of these areas. I have the word dearth. I don't think I meant it that harshly. I think we need more. We just simply need more. I think there's great opportunities for great research. Equivocation as to the causes of climate change, I'm not even going to talk about that. And crisis amnesia. And it's so easy over time to forget just how bad it was. And I'm done. I get to be a panel of one, too, if somebody
Yes,
wants.
so we have time for a few questions.
I live in an area that had tendencies of rain this spring, and I don't know how, you can't fix it, so it's hard to monetize, but I would hope that your economic losses include economic loss of soil tonight.
The question was that she had high rainfall, and she would want to know that the economic losses involved quantifying the value of the lost soil. And the answer is no, we don't. No, not really, we don't. Basically, when we do economic impacts, especially when we do economic impact studies, what we want to know is what's happened to our current productivity. And now you're talking about your long-term productivity as well as a diminution of your assets, right? And we don't do that. I mean, you can do it, and you could put a price on what's the loss of my soil, but that's not how we do economic impact analysis. What we really want to know is how is our economy affected in the short term? I have a very narrow horizon. I live right now in this year. And that's it. That's good enough for me. And I know, I understand, but it makes me happy. That's one of the problems. That's one of the problems, though, that we don't understand. We think that there are great impacts. It logically looks like there might be a great impact, whether it's an erosion of a natural resource or the loss of an amenity or the inability to utilize Cedar Rapids downtown like I used to. When we look at that, but then if you back away, guess what? That economy could take that punch. Productivity didn't really change in that region. If I needed to get a divorce lawyer, I could get a divorce lawyer. I just had to go out of the flood region. I could get a cup of coffee. I could get a muffler. The productivity at the factories was rapidly brought back online. And before you know it, we don't even notice a hiccup in our economy at all because we're so good at coping with these types of losses. So there's a big difference between the loss as realized, and you lost your soil, versus what it means for the economy in the short term.
Question.
When you were showing the $3.5 billion loss,
Yeah.
you said those were compensated losses. And I guess before that, you had given a list of all the possible losses that included things like quality of life, so non-market
Yes.
values. And I guess what I'm trying to get a sense of, because I don't really know what compensated versus non-compensated losses are and so on. How big a fraction of the total losses do you think are captured by that $3.5 billion? Is that most of it? Is everything else just kind of change, or is that, you know?
No. Most of it, okay, what's the worth of your family album that got flooded? Okay, you have all of these things. What's the enjoyment you had in your home? The peace of mind that you have. There are all kinds of non-market kinds of things, but there are also all kinds of tangible things that we don't trade, which is your quality of life, your comfort, your status, where you are. The government systems don't deal with that at all. The compensation doesn't deal with that at all. We're just thinking in terms of what kind of damages occurred that resulted in losses that could be compensated by the Small Business Administration, by FEMA, by any of the number of organizations and or the insurance companies that would offset those losses. And again, the gap between those payments and whatever that real value of loss was is what we have to eat. Sure. Yeah, of course. And I'll give you a great example, and we'll do this really quick here. You already.
Can you just repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you assess the benefits and costs of building in floodplains? And the answer is yes. FEMA and the Corps of Engineers are pretty good at assessing that and deciding what are the areas that in investing and protecting them, we can prevent future losses to the extent that it's in society's interest to invest in this, and what are the areas where that isn't a good idea. And we had that example in Cedar Rapids. They had a plan that they want to protect both the west side and the east side, but the Corps of Engineers says no, the benefit cost, the net benefits only accumulate by protecting the east side. The west side doesn't qualify for federal funding. And so they had to come up with another funding mechanism to fund the rest of their plant. Now, the justification for that on that west side isn't net benefits to society. You have to use non-tangible, other types of values to quantify that, as in, we want to take care of the west side, we're willing to subsidize those costs. This is important to take care of both sides. We can't just take care of one side. That's a political trade-off, not a market efficiency trade-off. The federal government, when they fund those types of things, will always lean towards the market efficiency.
Last question.
Talk about the impact of climate change on Iowa.
Yeah.
What is the impact of Iowa on the climate and on the environment? An example, what is the impact on fishing in the Gulf of Mexico?
Okay. Yeah, he asked the question, what is the impact of Iowa on the climate and/or the environment, and much broader? And again, the question was related to the fishing and otherwise biological diversity that might exist in the Gulf of Mexico. The answer is, I'm going to accept that for just a second. In the main, most of what we do in Iowa isn't offensive to the rest of the universe. However, what we are doing and contributing to from some of our runoff, the consequences of runoff down into the Gulf, that is significant, and it's unarguably part of an upper Midwest problem, and Iowa contributes to that. And what's the value of that? It's still to be determined. Well done. Thank you.